This morning, we're going to continue in our series. This will be number 11, 7 ways to read the Bible. And we're going to eventually end up here in Romans today, but we're going to discuss things about Romans before we actually read from Romans. And I have some things to read by some folks that have some interesting things to say. So in this portion of 7 ways to read the Bible, we're going to talk about rhetoric. And rhetoric is a form of speech. It's a form of language. It's something that, as we'll see, there's going to be some examples I'm going to give of how we use rhetoric all the time in our everyday language. And we don't even realize it probably, right? So it's kind of neat. There's, I know this is a little far ahead, but there are 31 rhetorical devices. 31. I read some of them to Lisa the other day, and they have really weird names, but it was kind of cool. And once you read some of them, the description of them, I'm like, oh, well, I recognize that. That's something that I've said before, or I've even seen it on TV in programs, crime dramas. So it's really interesting. Now, I am not an expert in the English language. I went to school. I had to take English. But I will admit that sometimes when I'm out there sitting and my dad's up here talking and he's talking about some form of language, prepositions and all that stuff, I forgot it, and I don't remember it. So as I'm speaking about rhetoric, I'm using other people, and we're going to read from some of them that are experts in rhetoric, so we can describe it. Because rhetoric is used by humans to talk and to write, who wrote all this down? Humans. And so when they wrote it down, sometimes, especially the Apostle Paul, they used rhetoric. And if you read something and you don't realize it's rhetorical, you might come away with a completely different understanding than what the writer was actually trying to convey. And that's what we're going to look at this morning, which is kind of neat, I think. So from a site I found called Literary Devices, and that's who said there was 31 forms. That was to them. Other people say there's more or less. But they say, rhetoric is the art of using language to persuade, motivate, or inform an audience via writing or speech. This is also known as the art of discourse. The goal of rhetoric is to move the audience to action through effective arguments. While rhetoric was originally seen as most important for political discourse, I'll insert here, that's probably where we recognize it most from, and we hear the term rhetoric, oh, I don't want to hear any more of your rhetoric. I want to hear, blah, blah, blah. It was most important for political discourse. Scholars who study it find examples of rhetoric in a wide range of fields, from fine art to fiction to architecture. Rhetoric is involved when communication is used to achieve to a certain end. The word rhetoric comes from the Greek word rhetorikos, which means oratorical. The root word is from the Greek word ero, which is I say. Makes sense. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started into this. Lord, we're thankful that there are some folks here with us today, both in person and on Zoom, Lord. We're thankful for all that attend. We're thankful that they attend because they have a desire to know more about the scriptures and the Bible, and more about you, Lord. And hopefully we take these things to the best of our ability and understand, as we're talking now, how to read the scriptures as you partnered with human beings to write that and allowed them to write forth of their experiences with you, the things they learned of you, And so some of the things that they write are things that we need to seek to understand so that we can make sure that we get the best possible understanding and use out of what's trying to be conveyed to us, so that we could take these things and put them into our lives, so that we can live for you and shine like lights in the world. Amen. So, when I first did this series, about 2 years ago actually, I learned, and what we talk about today is going to be a little more in depth than the first time I talked about it. Because remember, the first time I talked about it, we were doing kind of a book review of A More Christ-Like Word by Brad Jerzak. And since then, I've learned more things and put some more things into it, and a little more in depth about rhetoric today. I had learned at the time that there were many books on rhetoric and Paul. I have since purchased some of those books. I'll admit that I haven't really read a lot of them yet. I have stacks of books. I'm reading this one and this one and this one, usually a few at a time, and then the ones that I breeze into and I'm like, oh, this one's going to have to wait because it's a little too hard for me right now. That's what these books are. But it's interesting, and I really can't wait, after learning the things over the past couple of weeks about rhetoric, I can't wait to get more into it. Some scholars believe that much, or at least some of Romans, large sections of Romans and Corinthians, I've learned also, 1st and 2nd, and Luke and Mark to a certain extent, and John, all used rhetorical devices to one extent or another, and Jesus. Now, Paul and Jesus used them most effectively. Luke followed because he was educated. John and Mark, not as effectively because they weren't learned in speech like the others were, but they did use them. It said Mark used it at the least. Mark might have used it like we use it in everyday language. We're going up towards Paul. Luke and Paul used it effectively to make an argument for something. So some people disagree, and one of the reasons they disagree are what we said last week. Most Christians want to pick up the Bible and just have it be simple, literal, that's it. What I read is what it is. Because God would give us something like that. God wouldn't give us something that we have to work at. Why wouldn't God just say? Why? Well, I believe why is because we have brains, we can think, we all have different experiences in life, we all learn things from different people, and we all put them together, and they're all going to sway where we go. And God is working with us. He's not like the school teacher that's saying, this is it. And then you walk away and that's what you think for the rest of your life. He's working with us, right? He worked through people. If people use language in a certain way, if Paul uses rhetoric and Jeremiah does not use rhetoric, but God is speaking plainly, how would that make sense? It wouldn't make sense. It would, to me, indicate that maybe through Jeremiah, I don't know if you use rhetoric or not, but they did say there is rhetoric in the Old Testament, beginnings of it, because it was more put forth by the Greeks. But how would one use rhetoric and the other wouldn't? Why would God choose Paul to make his stuff rhetorical and another one not to, if God was trying to speak plainly? Why would there be poetry in the Bible versus history in the Bible if God was just trying to speak plainly, right? So we accept that there's some forms of things in the Bible, but we don't want to accept that there's others. Because if we accept that there's others, it might make it too challenging. And we can't have it too challenging, right? It's interesting to think about these things. So it does not make it false, and it doesn't make it a lie. It just makes it a way that someone is communicating. And if you know that they're communicating that way, and you know something about them, what does that say in God's mind about you? Carl really is interested in me. And he's interested in someone I chose to show who I am. But if someone else doesn't take the time to do it and says, whatever, it is what it is, that's what I want to believe. It's not that God thinks less of them, but God might say, well, they're on a little different field. I need to work with them a little differently than the other one. I don't know if God thinks that way. It's just an example to show that sometimes we need to read and study to see how things work. So how does Paul use rhetoric? Paul sometimes writes from the viewpoint of either a fictitious character or of the people he's speaking to. So he's speaking to a crowd of people, and Paul is smart. He did his homework. He knows what they're thinking already. And so he gets up and he speaks just like he's one of them. And they're all like, yeah, right? But as his discourse goes on, all of a sudden they start to realize, oh, that's not what he thinks. He's turning this around on us. And he uses that to make his argument, right? So other times he might even, he makes it that he is like a character as them. And then he refutes himself, basically. And they can start to see that. And some people might say, well, that's a little confusing. But as I said, rhetoric is common, even today, as a form of conversation in speech or writing. And usually, most people, when something's rhetorical, they get it because we speak it as modern people together. And we understand, oh, they're just, that's rhetorical. They don't really mean that. They're trying to say something different in different ways. So there's a man, he's a professor of biblical studies from Lexington Theological Seminary. And this was written in August 2015. His name is Jerry L. Sumney. I've never read anything else by him, just this, because I searched it. He says, the Apostle Paul is often seen as harsh, narrow-minded authoritarian who issues edicts to browbeaten little groups of people. I have to say, the first few sentences, he makes it sound like a lot of people are really critical and harsh of Paul. I personally don't know anybody like that, but I have read that there are people like that. So he says, these demands are commonly seen as perversions of the loving ideas of Jesus. Such portraits misunderstand both Paul and Jesus. Part of the reason people have this impression is that what Paul says can only be understood clearly if we recognize that everything Paul wrote was intended to address specific circumstances that have arisen in his churches. His letters are real letters sent to specific people to respond to particular circumstances that they face. Sometimes they have sent him a message or even a letter of their own asking for advice or describing what at least some in that church see as a troubling development. This means that we cannot be sure that what Paul talks about in his letters is what he would have thought most important. He is reacting to questions and problems rather than just setting out what he thinks members of the church should believe or do. Before Paul had arrived in their cities, most members of his churches had never heard of Jesus or the church, and many knew little of the God of Israel. As a result, they needed help in understanding what is expected of them in this new religious community. To better understand Paul, we should give thought to how all of his writings come from and must communicate with an environment that is very different from ours. Many of his views develop out of his Jewish identity. I thought that was really interesting, right? So we say, well, we have the letters of Paul, the epistles, and we read them, and we just assume that everything he's talking about is directed at me. But when Paul wrote the Corinthians, someone from Corinth, or he saw it himself, people from Corinth were communicating with Paul. Paul didn't just sit down and write letters for nothing and send them out to people. He communicated with people. He wrote letters back and forth. We know that he had people like Timothy that were in churches that reported back to Paul what was going on. And some of the people in the churches would talk to Paul. So Paul was addressing specific things to that group, not saying that what he was talking about was a general thing for everybody, but he's speaking directly to them for a specific reason. And of course, we could take what he said, because most of them are applicable. We could take what he said and say, yes, we should live or act a certain way. But I find that very interesting, that quote by Jerry L. Sumney. So, in Romans chapter 1, verses 18, all the way to chapter 3, verse 20, is thought by many theologians and scholars to be rhetorical. That has major consequences on how we should view what's being written in those verses. In a blog, September 29, 2015, by a man named Les Bridgman, he's talking about a book by Douglas Campbell called The Deliverance of God, which I definitely want after reading this. In his book, this is Les talking. In his book, The Deliverance of God, Douglas Campbell argues that Romans 1:18 through 3:20 should be read as an ancient form of rhetoric known as, and I don't want to butcher this because it's a really long word, prosopopoia. Okay? Or, in modern day terms, parody. You know what parody is. This type of literary device was used in the writings of Plato to show the absurdity of an opponent's argument. When did Plato live? Was he alive when Paul was alive? No. He was alive in the Old Testament, towards the end of the Old Testament, right? The Greeks. That's when the philosophers started coming through. That's when the Septuagint was written. That's when philosophy started to become a thing. And even among the Jewish people, it was mixed and accepted. Plato and others, philosophers, are the ones that developed these forms of communication. So, I've never read anything by Plato that I know of. Paul probably read Plato, I'm imagining. He was very good at rhetoric, and he learned it from somewhere, right? I know he was trained, too, as a Pharisee. Maybe Pharisees were trained in that, too. I don't know. It says, if Campbell's interpretation is correct, much, but not all, of what Paul is saying in this section of Romans is not his view. It is primarily the view of his opponents, taken to their logical and absurd conclusions. Who are Paul's opponents? Pharisees. Because if you read in Romans chapter 2, what does he say? You. Right? He's talking to them. This means that Paul's forceful argument about God's wrath coming on the wicked, including religious hypocrites, chapter 2, is not what he thinks. Rather, it is how his opponents think. Paul's view, his gospel or good news, is that instead of God expressing his wrath towards sinners, God makes sinners righteous freely by his grace, as we find in chapter 3, verse 24. He justifies the ungodly, chapter 4, verse 5. And he demonstrates his love for sinners by Christ's death, chapter 5, verse 8. And we're going to read from chapter 5 here shortly. Paul's gospel is not that sinners will receive the judgment they deserve. It is that God loves sinners and he offers them his gift of righteousness. And as I was reading this, I thought of Jesus. Who did Jesus go to? Sinners, harlots, tax collectors, right? And what did he offer them? What? The Pharisees got mad because he just forgave sin of some lowly guy at the bottom of the pole. You can't do that. There was no judgment. There was just a forgiveness, right? Here are a few of Campbell's arguments worth considering. And then he gives a couple. We're just going to read a couple. Romans 1:18 to 3:20 is the only place in Paul's letters where he begins with an extensive elaboration of the human problem before he gets to the solution. In his other letters, he begins with or assumes the solution, the revelation of the good news of God's Son. In other words, Paul usually argues from Christ to other things. But if the traditional view is correct, he is doing the opposite in Romans. However, that manner of argument undermines Paul's typical approach. For example, we don't realize that we are sinners on our own and then come to Christ. Instead, the revelation of Christ shows us that we are sinners and offers a solution. We must begin with Christ and then understand everything else in light of that revelation. Paul's description of the Jews, especially in Romans 2:17 to 24, seems to be deeply ironic. and not views he could actually hold. Did he really think that Jews who rely on the law and boast in God commit adultery, steal, and rob temples? I'd say after reading this, I started thinking, I'm like, you know, every time I read that verse or those verses, sometimes I wondered, is he saying that Pharisees are all robbers, thieves, and adulterers? I'm no doubt some of them were, right? Because they're people. But, you know, sometimes you wonder. Someone brings something up and you stop and think. He says that isolated statements in this section contradict Paul's gospel. For example, God will repay each person according to what they have done in 2:6 cannot be true if all are justified freely by his grace in 3:24. And for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous in Romans 2:13, contradicts Paul's conclusion in that very section. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. So in one verse, according to Mr. Campbell, it seems to be saying that hearing the law doesn't make you righteous. Obeying the law, doing the law, makes you righteous. But then at the end of the section, which he says is rhetorical, Paul says, nobody's going to be declared righteous by doing the law. But it seems that a while later, he just said, only people who do the law will be declared righteous. So now I read that and I can see how one is rhetorical, parody, because he's speak. You have to do the law to be righteous. So what was he doing? He was standing up there writing this letter, and another one said, which I didn't bring the quote down because I don't want to just read quotes all morning, but they said that these letters weren't like letters that you would get from a friend. This was a letter that was a speech. It was meant to be stood up and read because Paul would desire that. He was standing right there saying that thing to a group of people. So he's saying to them, do the works or you won't be righteous. And the reason he's saying that is because he's trying to get into their heads. That's what you think. And I'm about to tell you that's not correct. So he's using rhetoric to build an argument. And then someone else also said that when you hear the word argument and rhetoric, it's not argument like Danny and I used to have when we lived at home and he was doing something I didn't want him to do and we got into a big argument about it. It's an argument that's constructive. It's laid out in a constructive sense so that we could discuss something and learn something, or you could listen to me and learn something from it. That's the kind of argument. So we don't want to think that Paul was running around red-faced, screaming and yelling at people and arguing, because he wasn't. He was in order. He was very good at it. He could stand there and remain calm and smile and get people to like him, even when he was really talking down to them. They didn't even realize it until towards the end of a section or a conversation. And then the light would click on in their minds. And of course, then some hated him, right? They wanted to kill him, drive him out of the city. He had to be rescued and everything else. So Romans 5:15-18, we're going to read that. We're not going to read all of Romans 1 and 2. If you want to read Romans 1 and 2, you can read it when you get home. I think most of us know what we can find in Romans 1 and 2. And many times we call it the human condition or what people are really like and what God thinks of them. And if you read all that, and the wrath of God is coming because of all these things, right? Because as Christians, we like to do that. Romans 1 says, and then we like to go to those passages and read through everything that people are. God's wrath is coming because of that. Have you ever read Romans and questioned? I have, but because I'm not a scholar, I thought, well, I guess I really don't know, right? It never occurred to me that this could possibly be rhetorical and that maybe Paul was speaking in a certain way. Until one day I read Mr. Jerzak's book, and I read that. I'm like, oh, what's that? And so then I started looking things up. If I read Romans 1 and 2, then I believe that someday God is coming to this earth, or when people get resurrected after they die, they're going to stand before God, and it's going to be awful. Right? Awful. Because of everything that they could have possibly done in their lives, or because the way humans are. But then, when we get to Romans 5, which we've studied extensively here in our church, when I get to Romans 5, I get a completely different picture. And I always think, well, it's because Jesus died on the cross, right? He forgave our sins. Some people would say, well, if you're saved, then you won't have to go through this wrath, right? Things like that. But we read in Romans 5, 15 to 18, but the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one, being Adam, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. The gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from the one transgression, resulting in condemnation. But on the other hand, the free gift arose for many transgressions, resulting in justification. For if by the transgression of the one, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundant grace of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. Now you could stop there and say, okay, it says right there, if you've received, then you're going to have abundant grace, and you won't have to worry about the wrath, right? But this next verse kind of takes all that and brings it all down into one neat little package. It says, so then, as through one transgression, there resulted condemnation to all men. Adam transgressed, and then from Adam all the way till now, in the future of humankind, there's something there hanging over them because of what Adam did. Then he continues, even though that's the case, even though through one act of righteousness, there resulted justification and life to all men. Now, it says men. I didn't read it from the NRSV, which I have here, but I'm pretty sure it would say to all people or to all humans, because they like to do away with some of the pronouns. Because Paul, when he wrote men, isn't excluding women. He's talking about the human race. Every single person in the human race has been justified through the one act of righteousness of Jesus Christ. That's what I'm reading here, right? Even though there's something that hangs over mankind because of what a man did many centuries ago, right? Even though, even with all the thoughts that come through my mind sometimes about other people, even though I can say to myself, oh, I can't believe I just thought that. I can't believe I just said that. That is totally un-Christ-like. Guess what? Justified. Even though. Doesn't matter. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, there are 31 rhetorical devices. So I'm going to say that you should look them up. You just look up rhetoric, and they have these 31 devices. You're immediately going to recognize some of them. One, they do it alphabetically, and I just picked a couple of the first ones. Apophasis. I might be saying it right, I might be saying it wrong. It might be apophasis, I don't know. It is the raising of an issue by not claiming to mention it. And I think I've used this more than once. The example they give is we won't discuss his past crimes. So I can think, I'm at work. someone's not doing their job. Me and other leaders are complaining about it. And one of us says, that's not even to mention what he did yesterday. That's rhetoric. I'm not going to mention it, but I want you to hear it. I want you to know it. Even if I'm not going to tell you he did something yesterday, I want you to know that he did something yesterday, right? It's rhetoric. The next one is analepsis. I think this one's really neat. It's a literary technique that involves interruption of a chronological sequence of events by interjection of events or scenes of earlier occurrences, or a flashback. I have watched numerous crime dramas where they interject flashbacks. Sometimes they'll say 3 months earlier, 2 years earlier, sometimes. And I think, well, these are the ones that the writers were most efficient. Don't say that at all. You're watching it, and all of a sudden, a scene breaks. I stream, so I don't have commercials anymore. I always think of the breaks as, oh, it's commercial time. But the scene breaks and another scene starts, and I'm watching it, and I'm slowly realizing, oh, this is not fitting. Oh, this is a flashback. And the flashback teaches me something. And then the show goes on. Then they have another flashback, and they might have 3 or 4 or 5, 6 flashbacks. And through all the flashbacks, in my mind, I think, I know who did it. Because now I think I know something, but in the end, I'm wrong. Because the flashbacks were showing me something, just snippets that were going to sway my mind. And they did that on purpose, because they wanted to make it so you wouldn't know who did it until the end, right? That is a rhetorical device. They're building an argument in your mind so that you can say what a conclusion is. But the argument they're building in the end is going to bring you completely to a different place. That's what Paul did. According to people who believe in rhetoric, that he uses rhetoric, that's what Paul did in Romans 1:18 through 3:20. So now you go home and read that passage. And I included Romans 5 in it because Romans 5 really shows that what he was saying in 1:18 through 3:20 is rhetorical. It's what the Pharisees believed. It wasn't what he believed. He was standing up there, but he wasn't really, he wrote it out in a letter, but in his mind, he was standing up there in front of this group and he was telling them something. And they were all on his side. And then he slowly worked out what the truth is in Jesus Christ. He was a smart guy. Very smart guy. And I love the series, what you said about him being humble. A lot of people don't think of Paul as humble. Like this guy who just wrote what people think about Paul. Because they don't understand who he was writing to, why he was writing, the situations they were in, and the things like rhetoric that he used to drive home points. He wasn't a mean guy. He wasn't an angry guy. He was effective in how he spoke, in how he made people understand things. So, the next thing we're going to talk about, which I have read some people think is part of rhetoric, but other people hold it separate, is hyperbole. Hyperbole is something that Jesus used often. And in this section, it is based from Brad's book. It is called The Parental Dilemma. And as a parent, you use this. After reading this, I'm like, oh yeah, I use this all the time. All parents do, right? Bosses use it. Anybody who has authority or is in leadership over someone else uses hyperbole. As a parent, you want to protect your child from danger. And so what do? You don't just say, don't do that, or you'll get hurt. You say, don't do that, or this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and your finger's going to fall off, and you're going to fall down the stairs, and then you're going to break your legs, and all these other things. You come up with the wildest possible thing that could possibly happen to drive home into their little minds, because they don't think about things like that, that don't do that, right? Don't do that. I'll share a story of my sister and I. I might have shared it before. I know I've shared it with Lisa. We lived in Michigan, I believe, And we were sitting in the car waiting for mom and dad. And, you know, in old cars, I don't think they really have them in new cars, really, but you used to have the lighter. Push it, it heats up, and there's a little coil in it. It pops out when it's time to light up your cigarette. Jennifer wanted to know what would happen if she put her finger in the lighter. And I am very sure, remembering back, that my mom and dad never told us, don't put your finger in the lighter. I tried to tell her not to put her finger in the lighter, but she did it. Then what do you think happened? She got burned, right? I remember in horror of looking at her finger, white, with the rings in it, right? Now, she was fine. She went in the house crying, and she was taken care of. But those are the kinds of things that kids do. We want to say, don't put your finger in that lighter ever, or your finger will fall off. You know, because we want them to know, don't do it. So when is Jesus doing that? He does it. When does God do that? I think God does it. The more I think about it, I think God did it back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, when he told them, don't do this, or this is going to happen. Don't do this, or this is going to happen. And I think God made it sound as big as it was. Now, it was big because they had a nation and it was ripped away from them. It was taken away. Or we could say they lost it, right? It was in their hands to keep it. It's do what they were supposed to do, but they didn't. So they lost it. It was gone. But you can also read a lot of the things that are supposed judgments and stuff, even in Psalms. God, do this to them. Those things didn't happen. But they were trying to come up with something because of their anger to say how much they wanted to happen to them, or God's trying to tell them, don't do this, please. If you do. So yeah, the parental dilemma. Matthew 5, 27 to 30. Go ahead and turn over there. We just have a couple of these, and then we'll amazingly get through everything in one time. So in Matthew 5, 27 to 30, we read, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone that looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay, so we just said two things. They make sense, right? Some people would contend that verse 28 might not really be true, but Jesus is saying, once it's in your heart, it's there, right? Verse 29 then says, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of your parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell, which is really Gehenna, garbage dump. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. There is a fearful passage. And some Christians take this and they make it super fearful. And the way they do it is they say, someday Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, he's setting up this kingdom. And in this kingdom, he's going to be ruling with a rod of iron. And you are going to be made to obey. And if you don't obey, these are the kinds of things that are going to happen in his kingdom. So these Christians that say that want to make his kingdom out to be not some kind of massive, peaceful, loving time that Jesus is coming to earth, but he's coming to earth with wrath and fury to judge. And if you are looking at a woman and you have lust for her in your mind, you better tear your eye out. Because if you don't, it might happen again. If it happens again, you know what's going to happen. So what happens when you do it again? Then you tear your other eye out. And now you'll be blind. And you won't be able to look at another woman and have lust in your heart. So you won't get the iron rod and be thrown into the fire. Pretty incredible passage. If you're a biblical literalist, If I'm a biblical literalist and I believe that everything God said, he just said plainly, and that's is what it is, then there is no way I could look at this passage and say anything else about it, but it's literal, right? There is another passage that we're going to read in Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 9. So why don't you go ahead and turn over there. Maybe in these two passages, Jesus is speaking to his hearers just like I would speak to my son. We have a wood stove. I don't want you to touch that wood stove because it's hot. We have a screen because the insurance company says we have to, right? Because I know that screen is not stopping my son from touching that wood stove if he wants to, because it's movable. It falls down. When the dogs are playing and one of their tails hits it, we used to call Kurt the klutz because that's what he would do. He would run across, tail wagging all over the place, and the screen falls down, huge bang, right? Now the stove is open and free. Danny never touched the fire. Not to my knowledge anyways. Lisa might be hiding it from me. She says no. Danny never touched the stove. So yay! Mom and Dad. We did have a cat that touched the stove. We tried to stop the cat all the time, but cats don't listen. The cat jumped on the stove and within a split second was off the stove. It didn't injure the cat. But now the cat knew, don't jump on the wood stove. Jesus is saying, don't touch the stove. He says in chapter 18, verses 1 through 9, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called a child to himself and set it before them. And he said, truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and drown in the depths of the sea. That is pretty extreme, right? Little kids are coming to Jesus. Don't stop them. If you stop them and one of them stumbles and doesn't come to me, you may as well throw yourself in the sea with a huge millstone around your neck and drown, because that's how bad it's going to be for you. What conjures up in your mind when you think of Jesus saying that to you? Hellfire and wrath and condemnation. He says, woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. I used to read that and think, I never want to be a stumbling block. And I don't want to be a stumbling block, obviously. I don't want to be because I shouldn't be. But I certainly don't have fear when I am. I'm sorrowful when I do something and I think back like, wow, that was really un-Christ-like of me, and that person knows I'm a Christian, and what I just talked about with them or what I talked about with them, that's not an example, right? That's a stumbling block. That's something that jumps in the way of then coming to Christ. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell. Well, the first thing that I'm going to say is, to me, obvious. If I go to heaven and I cause stumbling, and so I ripped my eye out, when I go to heaven, I'm getting my eye back because my body's going to be perfect, right? So, but Jesus is saying it's better for you to be there one-eyed than it is not to be there at all, because if you have 2 eyes and you cause stumbling, then you're going to be in the fiery hell. So another thing I always used to wonder is, if you cut off 1 foot, what is it that makes the other foot innocent? Because it's in your mind that it's happening, not in your feet, not in your hands. If a little kid goes by and steals a candy bar on the way out of the register, and the cop or the store person calls the cops and catches them, they don't say, my hand made me do it, right? The police don't charge their hand, they charge them as a person. It's your mind. It's not your appendages. This is hyperbole. It's not to be taken literal. Jesus is being like a parent. Like he just said, little children, if you want to be in the kingdom, you have to be like a little child. Thinking innocently. And I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. And some of that teaching might be in hyperbole because I'm going to be like a parent to you. And sometimes I might say things that I'm just trying to drive a point home, right? These are the things that we read in the scriptures. What did the father in the prodigal son do, or the parable of the lost son? He got up, he ran out to meet him after watching for him every single day and wondering how he was and where he was, and he had extreme compassion for him. He threw a huge party, and his other son got angry because he threw a party for him and he never had a party. And it just shows the heart of man. But what does the father say? You've always been with me. You've always had my compassion. Your brother's back. Compassion, compassion, compassion. That's the story of Romans chapter 5 that we just read. So, the whole picture is that mercy, James 2, we're not going to go there, James 2, 12 to 13, mercy triumphs over judgment. Even in that verse 13, just read that verse when you go home and think about it, right? Think about what James says in that verse. I'm not going to read it. In Galatians 5:1, it says, it was for freedom that Christ set us free, therefore keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. And then in verse 14, it says, for the whole law, what Paul's point was in Romans 1 through Romans 3, the law, what did it do? It showed people what they were. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Mercy eventually is shown to all. We are to live in a Christ-like way, which is you shall love others. And what is Jesus doing as he's talking? What is Paul doing as he's talking? He's trying to show people who think one way to think differently, to act differently, to do things differently. And the point they're trying to drive home by saying, don't do adultery, don't look at women lustfully, is because it's not loving. It's not loving. Adultery is not loving. Some people think it's loving because, oh, I really love the other person. And now I don't love the other person. But it's not really love, right? I mean, every situation is different, but in general, right? God wants to protect us and restore us. God is not a tyrannical king who is standing over you to judge and punish you at the first possible moment. He is a loving Father. The warnings and the woes, cut off your hand, are not threats. They are seeking to warn you that your actions have consequences that can harm not only you, but others. You could cause someone not to believe. Because we are loved so much, we are given seemingly outrageous things like cut your feet off as hyperbole to show us how serious it is. Not because you're going to face some huge wrath, but because God is loving and wants all people to come to him on their own. And he's using you to do that. These warnings are stern because judgment, the punishments we cause ourselves, can be horrible. Even in this passage ends, woe to you. Remember, even though it ends, remember that mercy triumphs over judgment. When we do things that we're not supposed to do, it's harmful to us and it's harmful to other people, right? Just like if you were trying to explain to your child, it can harm you or it can harm someone else if you do that. God is saying, Jesus is saying, Paul is saying, this is the way it is. This is the way you think. This is the way it really is. These are the things you can do that can harm other people and yourself, but this is the way it should be. And so in the scriptures, there are forms of language and communication that are used. And it doesn't always mean that you read it and it just is exactly what it says. Sometimes there's another point coming to us. A lot of people, many people, leave Christianity or say things about the Bible, it has contradictions. I used to say the Bible has no contradictions. It has apparent contradictions. That's irrefutable, I believe. Except they're not really. Paul seems to contradict himself. So someone could say Paul's contradicting himself about salvation. On one hand, he's saying you have to do law. On the other hand, he says you don't. He's not contradicting himself. He's using a form of speech to show people something that think like him or that think like he used to. And so he could do that. The Bible has that all through it. Hyperbole, rhetoric, poetry, other forms of writing, I'm sure. It's helpful to know them. Just is. It's helpful. It's helpful for us so that we can get to know God on a deeper level and then show that to other people. Amen. I'll stop there.